Imagine a world where your child, at just 7 years old, is ripped from your arms, their hair shaved off in a ritual that marks the end of their childhood. Picture the terror in their eyes as they're led away to a life of starvation, beatings, and psychological torment, all in the name of forging the perfect warrior. Now imagine knowing that this isn't a dystopian nightmare, but a deliberate system designed to break their spirit and rebuild them as a tool of the state. This was Sparta in 462 BC, and this is the story of a boy named Dimaratos, whose journey through the Agode, Sparta's state-controlled training system, reveals a truth far darker than the heroic myths we've been sold. Forget the glorified warriors of 300. Today, we're diving into the documented horrors of Sparta's hidden initiation rites, secrets so shocking they were guarded by threats of death. If you're ready to uncover the real cost of creating history's most feared military, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear the truth, and subscribe for more unflinching explorations of history's shadows. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and did you know about Sparta's dark side before today? Let's begin. In the autumn of 462 BC, 7-year-old Dimaratos stood in the courtyard of his family home, the cool air brushing against his skin as his mother, hands trembling, cut his hair short in the Spartan military style. He didn't understand why tears streamed down her face. All he knew was that today was the day he would leave home forever, destined to join the Agode, the system that would transform him from a child into a Spartan warrior. His father had called it a great honor, a path every Spartan boy walked, a source of pride. But Dimaratos' mother wasn't crying from pride. She knew the truth. Her son was about to enter a world of systematic brutality, a process designed to strip away his humanity and rebuild him as a weapon. She knew the boy leaving her today would never truly return. Even if his body survived the Agode's horrors, his spirit, the child she'd raised, would be broken beyond recognition. She kissed him one last time, whispering, "Remember you were loved. Remember you were my son." Then the state officials arrived, and Dimaratos was taken away to begin a 23-year process of indoctrination, exploitation, and abuse disguised as the ancient world's most honored training system. This is not mythology or sensationalized fiction. The practices I'm about to describe are documented by ancient historians like Plutarch and Xenophon, criticized by philosophers like Aristotle, and whispered about in scandalized gossip across the Mediterranean. Sparta's Agode was a machine that turned children into soldiers by destroying their individuality and enforcing absolute obedience through methods we'd recognize today as abuse. If you want to understand how a society could normalize the systematic exploitation of its own children, how trauma could be used to create loyalty, and how the concept of honor could mask horrific cruelty, then stay with me. And if this kind of raw, unfiltered history matters to you, subscribe now, hit that like button, and share this video to spread the truth about Sparta's dark legacy. The Agode began at age 7, when Spartan boys were taken from their families and organized into ageli, herds, a term that reveals how Sparta saw its children, not as individuals to be nurtured, but as raw material to be forged into weapons. Dimaratos was assigned to a communal barracks, stripped of his family name and given a new identity, Fox 7, a member of the Fox cohort. From that moment, his past life was erased. He lived under the absolute authority of the Paidonom, or boy herders, overseers who could punish, beat, or humiliate at will, as long as it served the goal of creating hardened warriors. The only rule was that the punishment had to break the boy's individual will and rebuild him as an obedient soldier. The other boys in his cohort, all strangers, became closer than family, not through love, but through shared trauma and survival. The cruelty began immediately, and it was deliberate. The boys were intentionally underfed, given just enough food to prevent starvation, but never enough to satisfy. Plutarch describes the thin barley gruel, flavored with a trace of pork fat, that filled the stomach momentarily but provided little nutrition. This wasn't a mistake or a resource issue, it was policy. The boys were encouraged to steal food from Spartan households or the enslaved helots who worked the land. But here's the psychological manipulation that defined Spartan cruelty. They weren't punished for stealing, but for getting caught. A boy who stole successfully was praised for cunning and resourcefulness. A boy caught stealing faced savage beatings, not for the theft, but for failing to be stealthy enough. This system rewired a child's moral compass, teaching that rules existed only because authority enforced them, that getting away with something was more important than doing the right thing, that cunning trumped ethics, and survival trumped morality. On his third night in the barracks, Demaratos, weak from hunger, felt his body trembling. He'd eaten almost nothing for days, the gruel barely sustaining him. An older boy, Alcides, who'd survived 3 years in the agoge, approached the new arrivals. His lean frame and hard eyes spoke of a child who'd learned to endure. "You need to steal, or you won't survive," he told them. "Some boys die in their first year because they're too weak or too stupid to steal well. Do you want to be one of them?" He pointed to a nearby house, the scent of baking bread drifting from its kitchen. "Wait until the family's asleep. Take only a little so they don't notice. And don't get caught or you'll wish you were dead." That night, Demaratos crept out, heart pounding with fear, guilt, and desperate hunger. He found the kitchen door unlocked. Why lock a door in Sparta, where theft was expected but failure was punished? Inside, loaves of bread cooled on a table, the smell overwhelming his senses. He reached for the smallest loaf, hoping it wouldn't be missed. But a voice behind him froze his blood. "What do you think you're doing, boy?" The homeowner, a middle-aged Spartan, held an oil lamp, his face showing not anger but satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Demaratos tried to run, but the man grabbed him and dragged him back to the barracks. The paidonomos on duty didn't care that Demaratos was stealing to survive, or that the state's policy had forced a 7-year-old into theft. He cared only that Demaratos had failed the test of stealth. The overseer woke the other boys, forming them into a circle around Demaratos, who was ordered to lie face down. The paidonomos selected a hardwood rod, 3 feet long and an inch thick, designed to hurt without causing permanent injury. "This one failed," he announced. He was caught stealing, not because stealing is wrong, but because he was clumsy and stupid. Watch what happens to those who fail. Then the beating began. 20 strikes across Demaratos' back and legs sent waves of pain through his small body. He screamed, unable to control himself, which only worsened his punishment. "He cries like a girl," the paidonomos sneered. "Spartans don't cry." 10 more strikes followed for his weakness. By the end, Demaratos was sobbing, his body covered in welts and bruises that would take weeks to heal. He was sent back to his mat with no food, his spirit crushed by the realization that this was just the beginning of what it meant to be Spartan. The next day, Alcides approached him again. "You failed because you went too early and were too loud," he said. "Tonight, I'll show you how it's done." That night, Alcides successfully stole food from the same household and shared a portion with Demaratos. The lesson was clear. Failure brought pain, success brought reward, and morality was irrelevant. This was only the start of the agoge's cruelty. The boys were forced to sleep on reed mats they gathered themselves from the river, breaking the reeds with their bare hands, leaving them cut and bleeding. They went barefoot year-round, even in the harsh mountain winters, wearing only a thin cloak regardless of snow or freezing temperatures. Showing discomfort was mocked. Seeking medical care was unmanly. Boys who shivered or fell ill faced punishment, and some died from exposure or untreated infections. Each death was framed as proof of weakness, a lesson that survival required hardness above all else. One boy in Demaratos' cohort, Leonidas, not the famous king, but a common Spartan name, was smaller and weaker than the others. He struggled from the start, unable to gather enough reeds for his mat, his hands becoming infected from the cuts. He developed a fever but was forced to continue training, to fight larger boys who beat him easily, to attempt stealing despite his clumsiness. 3 months into the agoge, Leonidas died, his infection spreading into his blood. He passed away on an incomplete reed mat, surrounded by boys taught not to show compassion. The paidonomos declared him unworthy, his body buried in an unmarked grave with minimal ceremony. The message was clear. Weakness meant death, failure meant erasure. Demaratos, watching Leonidas's mat being cleared away, felt a cold resolve settle over him. He would survive no matter the cost, because the alternative was to die forgotten. If this story is hitting you hard, if you're shocked by how a society could treat its children, then let me know in the comments. What do you think of the agoge so far? And if you believe we need to confront these uncomfortable truths about history, like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to join me in uncovering more hidden stories. The agoge didn't just break bodies, it broke minds, using psychological manipulation to ensure absolute loyalty. Boys were ranked against each other in every activity, running, fighting, stealing, enduring pain. Public rankings created a culture of rivalry where cooperation was impossible and trust was a liability. Your friend today could be your rival tomorrow, praised while you were punished. The isolation was profound, even in a crowd of boys who were never alone. At age 12, after 5 years of surviving starvation, beatings, and exposure, Dimaratos faced a new phase of the agoge. The Iras-Siraminos relationship, a mentorship system that's often romanticized but was far darker. An older Spartan, usually in his 20s or 30s, would choose a boy to guide through training. Ancient sources like Plutarch and Xenophon describe these relationships as noble, with the mentor teaching courage and virtue. But the truth, hidden behind euphemisms, reveals a disturbing power imbalance. These relationships often included intimate components, giving the mentor extensive control over the boy's body and life. In Sparta, where the relationship was compared to a marriage, the implications were clear, even if not openly stated. When Dimaratos turned 12, a 28-year-old Spartan named Aristomenes chose him as his Iramenos. Aristomenes, a respected citizen with a strong military record, watched Dimaratos during combat exercises, assessing his potential. Dimaratos had no say in the arrangement. One day, he was simply told that Aristomenes was his mentor, owed absolute obedience and loyalty. Aristomenes took him aside, inspecting him closely. "I am your Iras now," he said. "You will obey me in all things. My honor depends on your performance. If you fail, you shame me, and I won't tolerate shame. Our relationship is sacred, blessed by Spartan tradition. What happens between us is private. Do you understand?" Dimaratos nodded, his stomach tightening with anxiety. He'd heard whispers from older boys about what mentors expected, things that couldn't be spoken openly, things that filled their eyes with fear. These were not equal relationships. A 12-year-old boy, property of the state, had no power to refuse. Resistance meant social destruction, expulsion from the agoge, or being labeled unmanly. The mentor's authority was absolute, backed by the threat of punishment. Aristomenes wasn't cruel by Spartan standards. He provided extra food, helped Dimaratos improve his skills, and protected him from some abuses. But he also demanded intimacy, framed as sacred bonding essential for creating loyal warriors. The first time Aristomenes brought Dimaratos to his home, he ordered the boy to undress for a physical inspection. Dimaratos stood naked, Aristomenes' hands lingering in ways that had nothing to do with checking for injuries. "This is how Spartans bond," Aristomenes said. "This is necessary." What followed was a violation disguised as tradition, an act Dimaratos, even at 12, knew was wrong but could not resist. He had no one to tell, no justice to seek, because the men who defined justice were the ones perpetuating the system. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was institutionalized. Every Spartan citizen had gone through this as a boy, and every citizen knew what these relationships involved. Yet they continued, generation after generation, because they created warriors bound by trauma, willing to fight to the death for each other. Xenophon defends the purity of these relationships, but his need to do so suggests widespread skepticism among other Greeks. Plutarch's descriptions of deep emotional bonds hint at romantic and physical dimensions, framed as virtuous but rooted in coercion. Boys submitted because refusal meant losing everything in a society that valued only obedience. At age 18, after 11 years of surviving the agoge's horrors, Dimaratos was selected for the Crypteia, an elite initiation that was Sparta's darkest secret. Each autumn, Spartan officials declared war on the Helots, the enslaved population that outnumbered Spartans and worked their land. This declaration meant killing Helots wasn't murder but war, free of religious guilt. Young men like Dimaratos were sent into the countryside with knives and minimal supplies, tasked with hunting and killing the strongest Helots, those who showed leadership or resistance. The goal was to eliminate potential rebels and to force young Spartans to cross the moral threshold of murder, proving they could kill without hesitation. Aristomenes told Demaratos this was the highest honor, proof he was worthy of citizenship. Armed with a knife and a dark cloak, Demaratos was sent to a Helot village. He hid in a grove, watching exhausted, malnourished Helots return from the fields. He chose his target, a man in his 30s, strong despite his hardship, who seemed to lead others. At night, Demaratos crept into the man's home, where he slept beside his wife and children. In seconds, Demaratos struck, covering the man's mouth and driving the knife into his throat. The man's eyes widened in terror, his body went slack, and blood spread across the mat. The wife's scream pierced the night as Demaratos fled, the sound haunting him as he collapsed in a field, vomiting and crying for the first time since he was 7. He cried for the man he'd killed, for the boy he'd been, for what he'd become. But when he returned to Sparta and reported his success, he was praised, one step closer to citizenship. The Crypteia wasn't just murder. It was state-sanctioned terror, designed to keep Helots submissive and to transform young Spartans into killers who valued state power over human life. Some sources hint at even darker acts, suggesting young Spartans were encouraged to dominate Helots through humiliation or violation, reinforcing their absolute power. These euphemisms fit Sparta's pattern of using systematic exploitation as control, perpetuating a cycle where the abused became abusers. Spartan girls, too, faced their own forms of control. Lampedo, a girl in Demaratos' time, entered state training at 7. Unlike boys, girls returned home at night, but their days were filled with rigorous physical exercises, running, wrestling, throwing javelins, often in minimal clothing before male observers. This wasn't empowerment, it was eugenics. Sparta trained girls to produce strong sons for the military, their value tied to reproduction. Lampedo learned that weak girls might be married to lower-class perioeci, while only the strongest would wed citizens. Her training stripped away privacy, conditioning her to accept her body as state property. At 18, Lampedo faced a disturbing marriage ritual. Her husband, Lysander, abducted her in a staged kidnapping, a Spartan custom. Women prepared her by shaving her head and dressing her in men's clothing, making her resemble a young male Iromenos. This ritual, rooted in Sparta's male-dominated culture, helped men transition from the agoge's same-gender relationships to marriage. For Lampedo, it was traumatic, her naivety about intimacy leaving her unprepared for Lysander's expectations. She submitted because resistance meant ostracism. For the next 12 years, Lysander lived in the barracks, visiting her secretly to produce children. Their marriage was a duty, not a partnership, her role reduced to bearing sons for Sparta. Lampedo's first son, named Demaratos after her husband, faced inspection at birth. Weak infants were thrown into the apothetai chasm, a standard Spartan practice. Her son passed, but Lampedo lived with the terror of raising him until 7 when he'd enter the agoge. She bore 3 more children, each birth shadowed by the fear of rejection. Her daughter followed her path into female training, her sons into the agoge. When her eldest son was taken, Lampedo stood silent, knowing grief was weakness. She never saw him again as the child she'd raised. He became a stranger, hardened by the system. At 16 or 17, young men like Demaratos faced secret nighttime ceremonies, the agoge's most guarded rituals. After days of fasting and sensory deprivation, Demaratos was led to a remote grove, where masked overseers awaited. Given a wolf mask, he was told he was no longer an individual but part of the pack. The ceremonies involved humiliating acts, crawling through mud, enduring pain, performing transgressive rituals with peers to forge unbreakable bonds. These acts, too shameful to speak of, ensured loyalty through shared secrets. When Demaratos emerged, he was no longer the boy who'd entered. He was a Spartan, his humanity replaced by absolute devotion to the state. At 20, Demaratos joined a syssitia, a communal dining group of 15 men, including Aristomenes. Acceptance required a unanimous vote, and rejection meant social death. The syssitia reinforced conformity, with austere meals of black broth and strict rules against individualism. Demaratos ate food he hated, joined conversations that bored him, and maintained relationships out of necessity. Even at 30, when he could live with Lampedo, their marriage served Sparta's needs, producing children to feed the system. Demaratos died at 47 in battle, His last thoughts not of glory, but of the boy he'd been, murdered by the agoge's slow, deliberate violence. Sparta's system wasn't unique. It's an extreme example of patterns that persist in military and institutional cultures, breaking individuals through hardship, creating loyalty through trauma, suppressing identity for collective purpose. But Sparta paid a price. By the 4th century BC, its population dwindled, its economy collapsed without military dominance, and it became a hollow tourist attraction. The ruins of Sparta stand today, with little to show for its legacy, but the suffering of its children. What do you think? Can systematic exploitation ever be justified by military necessity? Do you see echoes of Sparta's methods in modern institutions? Drop your thoughts in the comments, like this video, share it to spark discussion, and subscribe for more raw history. Let's remember Demarados and Lampedo, not as glorious warriors, but as victims of a system that called abuse honor and left them with nothing but pain. See you in the next video.